Besides being addressed as Thomas, this thesis' name is Forgiveness and Remembering Well, a choice for onward movement and transformative. I'd like to take a moment to start with my acknowledgements. Walter Thiessen, on behalf of Thomas and I would like to thank you for your dedicated counseling. But really, this thesis would not have been possible without your direction, encouragement, and insights. Thank you so much for your gentle corrections of my constant grammatical errors and sometimes incomprehensible thoughts. Peter Fritsch, I thank you so much for your input and editing as my second reader. I could not have done it without you. Julia Roberts, where are you? I cannot even express to you how much I appreciate you reading and editing my entire thesis. You truly are my hero. Katie Ironside, thank you. Thank you for being the best flatmate a girl could have, for the many meals and desserts you've made, for washing the dishes, taking out the trash, and cleaning our apartment countless more times than I ever did. But more than that, thank you for your constant encouragement, your listening ear, editing skills, and unending silliness. It really has made this thesis a possibility. Mariah Petch, I so appreciate having you as a thesis buddy. Our solidarity and thesis dates have seriously been a huge encouragement. We've been in this together, and I'll still be rooting for you all the way through to your presentation. Thanks to my family for enduring months of hardly hearing from me, yet still supporting me so hard. For still supporting me all the way through. I could not have accomplished this without your support, and especially to my Aunt Jenny, who couldn't make it for her editing contributions. And last but not least, a huge thank you for this community and everyone who has been so supportive. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't. Your continual affirmation and encouragement has meant the world to me. Okay. That part is done. I wrote 4 chapters, and I will be going through them, focusing more on my first chapter and my last chapter, and trying to just touch on some of the key aspects of the middle 2. So I'll start with chapter 1 in my introduction. Chapter 1 is titled The Choice to Accept. In 1997, Katie Hutchinson was living a fairly normal life in the small town of Squamish, British Columbia. She and her husband Bob lived in a lovely home with their 4-year-old twins, Sam and Emma. It was New Year's Eve, and the family was enjoying their traditional get-together with their dear friends Gordie and Shauna from Vancouver, as well as their next-door neighbors. After the kids were in bed, the adults enjoyed conversations and wine together. It was a quiet New Year's Eve celebration for them. However, they heard the festivities of another neighbor's house up the road. They knew those friends were away on a holiday, leaving their teenage son Jamie alone for a few days. Bob tried to phone Jamie to check in, but there was either no answer or whoever did answer did not know where Jamie was. Bob, a kind-hearted man, decided to check out the party just to make sure it was not out of hand. He recruited his 2 friends to go for a little walk up the hill. The 3 men bundled up and headed out the door, leaving the ladies to continue sipping wine and anticipating the close midnight hour. Katie's life was significantly altered in the minutes that followed. Bob never came home from that party. It was soon discovered that he was murdered. He had experienced multiple blows to the head, hard enough and often enough that it ended his life. It took years and intense undercover police work to discover the truth behind the horrific events of that night, as everyone present at the party and their families hushed up the whole incident. That night, Katie lost her husband and her children lost their father. Their lives would never be the same again, all because someone so brutally extinguished his life. How does anyone move forward in life from something as atrocious as this? Could anyone ever forgive the individual who would commit such a brutal act? It does not seem possible, and it is not natural. The natural response would be revenge, anger, and justice, not forgiveness. Yet forgiveness is crucial and forgiveness is possible. The process of forgiveness takes great strength and courage to live out. John DeGrucci indicates that, quote, "The ability and willingness to forgive is a sign of moral courage and strength, and as such it is also a sign of wisdom. Forgiveness is the exercising of power in weakness and wisdom in apparent foolishness," end quote. A key aspect of forgiveness is choosing and learning how to remember well, which this thesis will explore. Remembering well is the act of recalling and processing the past event in a way that does not continue to allow wounds to fester, but enables healing to take place. This happens through the choice of acceptance, the choice to accept the event, the perpetrator, and the victim's own emotions. This chapter will be a foundational chapter to distinguish what this remembering well means and how that will be outlaid in the rest of my thesis. Before going on to that, I would like to distinguish between what forgiveness is not and what it is. Forgiveness has the immense power to heal wounded hearts and memories, and while it contains risk and may feel more painful, even than the initial hurts at times, the journey is well worth it. What forgiveness is not, however, is forgetting. There's the popular saying of forgive and forget. However, to forget an offense would only hinder the process of forgiveness. Forgiveness also is not reconciliation. Reconciliation is a process that comes after forgiveness. It's when there's a restored relationship between the victim and the perpetrator takes responsibility and is truly sorry for their actions and requests forgiveness, while the victim is also willing and able to offer forgiveness to the perpetrator. When reconciliation is complete, there is a sense of trust and understanding between both parties. Forgiveness and healing can happen without reconciliation. However, true reconciliation cannot happen without forgiveness. Forgiveness is the choice and the gift of the victim, whether it is received or not. Despite the response or lack of response from the perpetrator, the victim is still releasing the self from the captivity of his or her negative emotions. And then, moving on to what forgiveness is. Many people, In the process of forgiveness, the offense is, Forgiveness is a choice from the heart to onward from the offense. It is the acceptance and release of feelings such as resentment, hurt, and anger toward the perpetrator. It is a process of inner healing. Forgiveness is not an act of weakness. On the contrary, it takes great courage and strength to choose to forgive. The remainder of this chapter will explore what forgiveness is through the choice of acceptance. A victim can remember well in order to forgive well and encounter eventual healing. So forgiveness as a choice, by that I mean the victim has to intentionally choose to forgive. And to forgive wholly. The victim has two options. He can either dwell on the hurt, anger, and resentment, wishing the past event away, or he can choose to accept the facts as they are, letting go of the hopes for a better past and taking the courageous step to move forward with his life. This latter choice can release the victim from the negative emotions attached to an offense. A victim has the choice to offer this forgiveness as a gift to the perpetrator, and in doing so, he offers a gift to himself. Forgiveness, then, is also acceptance. Nothing can change what has happened in the past. Holding on to the negativity hinders any possibility for forgiveness and healing to take place. David Augsburger says, quote, "Forgiveness is acceptance with no exception. It accepts not only the hurt you received, it accepts the one who did the hurting, and it accepts the loss caused by the hurtful actions or words." By choosing forgiveness, victims are doing exactly this, accepting the past, the perpetrator, and the hurt as they are, in a manner that will allow them to move onward on the path to healing. Remembering well the past. First step. I sum up the healthy process of forming and telling forgiveness well. forming and telling a forgiveness-based narrative of the events of remembering well. As the memory of the offense will always remain, how the past is remembered is crucial. The forming and shaping of the memory of the offense is a significant aspect of forgiveness. Lewis Smedes says, quote, "Forgiveness does not erase the bitter past. A healed memory is not a deleted memory. Instead, forgiving what we cannot forget creates a new way to remember. We change the memory of our past into hope for our future." End quote. And next, the view of the perpetrator. It's a significant aspect of remembering well to change the view of the perpetrator, as opposed to viewing him or her as a monster, as someone who has been an enemy, or just as a person who has inflicted the pain, but as viewing the perpetrator as a person just like yourself, a fallible human being, who has made a mistake and also deserves forgiveness just like the rest of us. Forgiveness, then, is also a release from pain. Forgiveness and remembering well does not undermine one's emotions. Rather, these processes encourage the victim to face his emotions in a healthy manner. Forgiveness should not be used as an instant solution for these emotions. They are not going to disappear overnight. Forgiveness is a process and will take time, varying on the individual and the circumstances. The process of forgiveness helps individuals to deal with the emotions they have experienced and not deny them. It enables them to learn how to express when it is appropriate, but does not undermine them. It also encourages the victim to face them in a healthy manner that will lead to eventual healing. South African Bishop and head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Desmond Tutu, reflects on the TRC of South Africa after apartheid. He writes, quote, "A place where people could come to cry, to open their hearts, to expose anguish that had remained locked up for so long, unacknowledged, ignored, and denied. And finally having the place in listening, end quote. And finally having the place in listening ear to express their anger, anguish, and resentment, the people of South Africa were able to release many of their emotions in a healthy manner that led them to the ability to forgive as well as heal." Tutu elaborates, quote, "It was as if someone had waved a special wand which transformed anger and tension into this display of communal forgiveness and acceptance of erstwhile perpetrators. We could only be humbled by it all and be deeply thankful that so-called ordinary people could be so generous and gracious." End quote. This process then leads to my take on how narrative is important in the process of remembering well. Creating a story of one's experience and one's life helps integrate one's memories, emotions, and even view of the perpetrator, which was seen in the TRC in South Africa. Narrative, then, as I have defined it, is an important way to shape this process of forgiveness. It may be a written or spoken account of connecting together past events into story form. This process will significantly impact victims as they choose to accept their past, their perpetrator, and their emotions. This forming and telling of their story will allow them to fit the puzzle pieces of the event together and remember well. Through the narrative, a victim will face every aspect of the offense. He will remember what has happened, how the event unfolded, if those details are known, and what the initial reactions was. His emotions the next minutes, hours, and days. The victim will remember it all, the awfulness, the abuse, and the pain. He will face the whole truth. It is all part of his story, and it is far from easy. However, this is a needed part of the process of forgiveness, healing, and possibly for future reconciliation. Jerry Sitzer has great insight into this, suffering, as a man who lost 3 generations of his family in an instant tragic accident, his mother, wife, and young daughter. And he says, quote, "I learned gradually that the deeper we plunge into suffering, the deeper we can enter into a new and different life, a life no worse than before and sometimes better. A willingness to face the loss and to enter into the darkness is the first step we must take." End quote. This is similar to the experience of shaping one's narrative, sharing the story and accepting the facts as they are. It may be hard and it may be painful for a while, but the end result will be brighter and more hopeful. Forgiving and remembering well in this manner will lead to healing for both the victim and the perpetrator. This thesis, however, will remain focused on the victim's journey of forgiveness towards healing. Through forgiveness, a victim's pain can be healed. Smedes refers to pain that forgiving can heal as, quote, "pain of a wounded memory, the frustrated rage, the soul-choking pain," end quote. After the process of genuine forgiveness is complete, however long this may take, her memory will be healed, her emotions will have subsided, her narrative will be formed, and she will be able to continue living with a newfound hope for future grounded honestly in her past. Chapter 2, Healing Trauma, Integration Through Narrative. This chapter is a psychological-based chapter studying neuroscience and the effects that trauma has on the brain and how narrative can help reintegrate the disconnection that happens within the brain. I'll just read my introduction here. People have become accustomed to see what they want to see in many situations. They often shape their own memories the way they desire them to be. They create a narrative, a story, an account of thoughts, experiences, and interactions, both the good and the bad. While this may mean that individuals may have a positive view of their past, it may also result in dwelling on the negative, on the hurt and feelings of self-pity, on their own trauma, wallowing in the belief that they have been wronged. However, this is not healthy and will not allow one to move on from whatever wrong has been done. Furthermore, a serious offense is often a traumatic experience for the victim. The aftermath of trauma most often has psychological effects on the brain which can make the process of forgiveness difficult for the individual. After a traumatic experience, the brain's normal processing is disrupted, leaving the victim with disorganization as he tries to process his emotions and memories. In situations that require forgiveness, one's memories shape his attitudes and postures towards people. This begs the question, how could an individual move towards forgiveness for his offender if the memory of the wrongdoing is holding him captive? As it is difficult, if not impossible, to forget when the memories become a burden, it is the process of forgiveness that enables one to remember the past in a different light. To forgive fully and well, the victim must process and deal with the psychological effects of the event. This process can unfold by remembering well with the use of narrative. It is through the integration of narrative that forgiveness can be offered and a path to healing can be found. Once a victim can process their own emotions, they can turn their attention to offering the gift of forgiveness to the perpetrator. This chapter studies mainly two psychologists, Lois Cozzolino and David Hogue, on their views of neuroscience. I will briefly say a point of theirs, and then move on. Cozzolino, some of his thoughts that I've talked about is that healthy psychological functioning requires the cognitive integration and organization of all organization of the brain, specifically conscious awareness, behavior, emotion, and sensation. However, it is in times of unfavorable circumstances that there is a resulting disruption of this integration of information processing in the brain, such as difficulties in caretaking, genetic and biological vulnerabilities, or trauma at any time throughout life. The way the brain has developed through the lifespan to successfully cope with threat actually causes a vulnerability to long-term psychological problems. Following trauma, dissociated symptoms appear that will reflect the disconnection among networks of behavior, emotion, sensation, and cognition. Traumatic experiences result in a domino effect as trauma instills high levels of stress, which then cause a biochemical change within the brain's network. This will then inhibit or disrupt the brain's automatic integration capabilities. David Hogue, he looks at neuroscience in three ways that humans sense the world, which is through perceiving, remembering, and imagination. His views are, humans perceive persons, places, and things that are currently present around them. Images are retrieved from memories, short and long term, of people one has known, stories one has told, and experiences one has had. And finally, through imagination, one can also create new images of the past, what is happening now, and expectations of what is to come. Hoag approaches his exploration of the brain focusing on the two key areas of memory and imagination, which is what I also explore. Moving on to memory. Memory is another automatic process that humans have only partial control over. Hoag defines memory as recorded experiences, procedures, and events that have registered somehow in neural synapses of our brains. Memory, too, includes at least as many unconscious or implicit memories as it does those of which we are aware. And that was a quote. The way the past is remembered sets us up for how we react to the future. Suppressing or denying memories will only cause the wounds of the offense to fester and increase in pain. Remembering well opens the way for healing to unfold, and it is important for memories to be remembered wholly and well, because they impact so much of one's life. My chapter also then explores two forms of memories, emotional memories and trauma memories. Emotional memories are often can be triggered very easily by if there's like a smell or anything that associates with the event that has happened. And they're often irrational and make the victim feel a potential for threat. Trauma memories, I use a definition by Judith Herman, and she writes, quote, generally involves threats to life or bodily integrity or a close personal encounter with violence and death. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evoke the response of catastrophe. According to the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, the common denominator of psychological trauma is a feeling of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and threat of annihilation. End quote. Though this is a narrower definition of trauma, it speaks truth towards what the experience is like for some. Traumatic events also often leaves individuals feeling helpless and powerless as a result of the overwhelming stress. Herman describes psychological trauma as an affliction of the powerless. In trauma, victims are made helpless by the overwhelming force they are encountering. Traumatic events disrupt the usual sense of control, connection, and meaning the victim once had, and this can have potentially devastating psychological effects. Many serious offenses that people encounter involve trauma in some manner of the above. Moving on then to narrative as integration. The integration of the whole brain is so important after traumatic events. Trauma disrupts the brain's ability, normal ability of processing. Thus, narratives bring together those disconnections. Janet Vergren writes, quote, when patients talk about traumatic experiences, they frequently cannot tell the story of this experience. Rather, they relate bits and pieces of sensations, images, and effect out of which a narrative must be created, end quote. Often in a traumatic experience, people have trouble recalling the whole thing. There might be points of a memory that keep replaying, or there's other points that are entirely blocked out of mind, but they still can have unconscious effects on the emotional memory, the emotional response of victims. So it's helpful for narrative to take the event and create that story addressing every aspect of the event that has happened, which then will reintegrate the psychological disconnect, which I didn't go into too much in the presentation, but also the memories and the emotions and the event itself that are themes in my thesis. It enables them to better understand and deal with what has happened, and then it leads to healing. But also then Once those are addressed and the victim has began the healing process, they can also turn their attention back to the perpetrator and begin the process of offering that forgiveness. Chapter 3 is a theological approach to forgiveness, and it's titled God's Forgiveness as Our Forgiveness. As Christians, we strive to live up to Jesus' teachings. Time and again, he encourages us to forgive others their sins, and we too will be forgiven. However, it is not enough to simply appear to have forgiven or to give it out cheaply. Proceeding in life without a change of heart or desire for healed brokenness and harmony. This is not the forgiveness that God desires us to live out. The process of forgiveness is an embodied way of life that mirrors God's forgiveness. It is a costly and risky craft to learn that takes practice and skill. The process of forgiveness has individuals embark on a lifelong journey of learning, beginning as an apprentice and eventually becoming a master. Since offenders are undeserving of forgiveness, especially if they are unrepentant, the offering of forgiveness is a gift the victim grants to his offender. Victims must choose to genuinely embody forgiveness before the process and healing can unfold. The nature and practice of forgiveness has been centered to many religious faiths, and perhaps most particularly the teachings of Jesus. Thus, Christian theologians have much to teach us about remembering well. Forgiveness is more than just saying, "I forgive you," because it is required. This chapter will explore forgiveness as a gift and a way of life in light of God's forgiveness, which will deepen an understanding of what it means to remember well. This chapter explores forgiveness in a way that it's modeled after God's forgiveness. And it's something as Christians we strive to live up to the role that he has, the way that he has set out for us, specifically in the death and resurrection of Christ, the sacrifice of his son for our sins. So, forgiveness is a word with many meanings and layers of truth, similar to a set of Russian dolls. By just looking at it on the surface or the outside, forgiveness is a simple word spoken to pardon the offense of another, the first and largest doll. However, inside this doll there is another, which represents the choice made to forgive an offender. Going even deeper, the third doll may represent the change in heart of the victim as he has decided to forgive. And so it goes on, each doll representing another layer of the process of forgiveness. L. Gregory Jones, an author and professor of theology, has recognized that in order for the depth of forgiveness to work down through all these layers, it must be a part of a way of life that we choose to live, imitating the unconditional love and continual forgiveness of our Heavenly Father. The unconditional love God grants us is a love of acceptance no matter what. God chooses to accept us for who we are. In this way, his forgiveness reflects the components of remembering well. God's forgiveness is that of great compassion and grace for his children, yet it is a costly and risky forgiveness. The costliness of forgiveness is the giving up of oneself, one's dignity, and be so vulnerable to give the gift of forgiveness. Our forgiveness should mirror God's in embodiment and costliness. Jones argues that the overarching context of Christian forgiveness is that of God's forgiveness, who was willing to bear the cost of all sin to restore humanity's communion in his kingdom. I'm not going to go into everything here, but I'm going to skip to talking briefly about the craft of forgiveness as a way of life. The choice and acceptance of remembering well does not come easily or quickly. It is one thing to make the choice of acceptance. It is another to act upon that choice. It takes time and effort to embark on the process of acceptance. There are tools and practices that one will need to learn. It is much easier for humans to succumb to feelings of anger, hate, denial, and resentment, and act upon those. Learning how to remember well and practice forgiveness takes patience, intentionality, practice, and skill, all reasons for Jones to claim that embodying forgiveness is a craft. Just like any craft such as carpentry or sculpting, forgiveness and remembering well needs to be learned. Thus, one will start out as an apprentice, continually practicing and learning new skills until one day he will become a master of the craft. This learning can take a lifetime. Thus, the embodiment of forgiveness is a way of life. An individual who decides to take up the craft of forgiveness will spend his life investing time, energy, and thought into mastering this art of forgiveness. Mastering the craft of costly forgiveness involves the cultivation of habits and practices such as judgment, repentance, and confession, and love for the enemy. Learning the craft of forgiveness cultivates great character and virtues within individuals for living in friendship with God and embodying His forgiveness. A quote, another quote by Jones goes as such. Hence, the craft of forgiveness requires an ongoing process of re-narrating the past so that we can remember it truthfully and well. And as such, we need not to forget, but to cultivate a timeful embodiment that enables us to remember the past in the context of liberating new life, orient to God's eschatological future. End quote. Because forgiveness is an ongoing process throughout one's life, it must continually be embodied. In some sense, then, the memory of the past will also repeatedly be encountered. Consequently, the craft involves reshaping and remembering well the past, within the context of the victim's own life, the perpetrator's life, and the narrative of God. A tough thing about forgiveness and memory is the fact that it's one thing to forgive once and remember once, but you'll always continue to remember, and each time the memory is recalled, you have to be able to have that forgiving, I lost the word I was going to say, forgiving attitude, and be able to offer that again and again. It's not just a one-time thing. I also talk about forgiveness as being a gift to the perpetrator. All of humanity is on equal ground. No one is superior to the other. Each of us have hurt others. Each of us has been hurt. And so we must own up, take responsibility for our lives, and forgive. God offered His forgiveness to everyone, not just to those who are repentant or commit minor sins. His gift to us is all-inclusive, and so are our gifts to others should be as well. Miroslav Volf explores the idea of embracing the other as opposed to excluding him. Forgiveness is a prime opportunity to embrace. And Volf views a lack of forgiveness as a double exclusion. He says, quote, "Forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners. But no one can be in the presence of God, but of the crucified Messiah for long, without overcoming this double exclusion. Without transposing the enemy from the sphere of monstrous inhumanity into the sphere of shared humanity, and herself from the sphere of proud innocence into the sphere of common sin." End quote. The victim views himself above the perpetrator and views the perpetrator as unworthy of forgiveness. This exclusion also hinders any chance of healing for the victim or the perpetrator. It hinders any chance for reconciliation. On the contrary, this view nourishes the negative emotions. Volf continues, quote, "Hidden in the dark chambers of our hearts and nourished by the systems of darkness, hate grows and seeks to infest everything with its hellish will to exclusion. In the light of the justice and love of God, however, hate recedes and the seed is planted for the miracle of forgiveness." End quote. With time and new insight through the concept of remembering well the perpetrator, the victim will be able to see himself and his perpetrator on equal levels. It is through the new perspective of the perpetrator that the victim is able to embrace and forgive his enemy. Lewis Smedes speaks into this also, claiming that we are not really as innocent as felt when we were first hurt, and we do not usually have a gigantic monster to forgive. We have a weak, needy, and somewhat stupid human being. When you see your enemy and yourself and the weakness and silliness of the humanity you share, you will make the miracle of forgiving a little easier." End quote. Once this point is reached, the victim can more easily give the valuable gift of forgiveness. 5 minutes? How did that happen? Good thing I was almost done. Stopped, so she didn't think it was right to or necessary to respond in anger. So in this chapter, I pulled together some aspects of the psychological chapter and the religious chapter, my theological chapter. And Katie doesn't particularly claim to be a religious person, but in reading her story and understanding her story, I believe that she still embodied God's forgiveness, whether she believed in Christ or not. She was striving for love and reconciliation, and she wanted to make things right. She took the risky step of offering that costly forgiveness to Ryan, and she desired the truth of the past to be revealed in order for the brokenness to be healed. And she had hope of eventual reconciliation and harmony, and this is how God also wants us to forgive. So, an incredible thing about this, she did meet Ryan, not immediately after the arrest, but the police allowed her to make a video that they had Ryan watch in his interrogation. But they did meet shortly after, and he was truly sorry and remorseful. He had tried to hide from what had happened, and he didn't want to believe that what he did was something he did. He was drunk and angry at the party. Young man, 20 years old. But he was willing to pay the consequences. And he was so sorry for what he had caused Katie and her twins. But he was entirely grateful for Katie's gift of forgiveness. There's a quote here I wanted to read. Here. And he responds to the gift of Katie's forgiveness and writes, quote, "Katie's forgiveness is the most incredible thing that anyone has ever given me. It changed my life. There's trouble every day in prison, offers of drugs and threats of fights, but I don't give in. My life would still be full of anger and violence if it wasn't for Katie." End quote. A lot of what forgiveness strives for is ending the violence, the cycle of violence. And that Katie and Ryan's story truly is an example of that happening. Briefly on narrative then in this. Katie formed what she entitled The Story of Bob, and even before it was known who had murdered Bob and when the investigation was still going on, she was going around to middle schools and high schools and other conferences telling the story of Bob. The tragedy, all of what had happened, but also the life that Bob had lived. He was a very optimistic man, and he lived a full life. He was into sports and just wanted the best in life. And Katie shared that story and then also tying into how forgiveness is important in that. So despite the missing information surrounding Bob's death, Katie did form that narrative. It was years later that she was able to know what had happened in that room of that house on New Year's Eve in 1997. But she writes, quote, "Sharing stories, even the most painful stories, illuminates the path of our humanity. The experience of victims and offenders is often painfully lonely, often silent. To see our stories stitched together into a community with a voice gives me a true sense of safety, peace, and connection. And that, for me, is real justice." And briefly, Katie and Ryan went beyond that forgiveness, and they did form a reconciliation. Ryan actually joined her in her sharing the story of Bob, and they did it together for years, which is incredible. They do say that they are friends, although they are sensitive to the fact that other people are uncomfortable with that. They keep each other at a distance, and they don't, there's still the pain of the past in there. but they have definitely overcome it. So, just to conclude that chapter and my thesis, I will read the last little bit. Katie's journey through murder, justice, and forgiveness is an example of victory over tragedy. It is a journey that challenges humanity's social expectations of the experience of victimization. Katie's response to this terrible misfortune was a risky act that required great strength, love, and compassion. Katie's choices to accept and remember the tragic death of her husband well and even forgive the perpetrator is unthinkable to many, but a beautiful example of the power of love, grace, and forgiveness. Katie could have chosen to deny what had happened. She could have avoided her emotions with the help of sleeping pills, and she could have withheld giving the gift of forgiveness to Ryan, but she did not. She embraced it all with as much strength and courage as she could muster and chose to live well. In the final pages of her book, Katie writes, quote, "Looking meant feeling, as painful as it was. Feeling led to accepting the reality of losing Bob, dealing with the way in which he died, and learning to live after that loss. And accepting those realities was the beginning of the healing. Looking, feeling, dealing, healing. If I had avoided any part of that process, I believe I would not be where I am today. In looking, I found strength. I found my voice, my heart, a future." End quote. Katie's process of forgiveness, her choice of acceptance with the incorporation of narrative, is how she remembered well and allowed a process towards healing to unfold. Katie was able to love and support the man who killed her husband, and she was able to wish him a productive and happy life, the kind of life that her husband had lived. Katie was able to forgive and remember well. The popular saying, "forgive and forget," assumes that offenses can be put out of one's mind once forgiven. However, this is not the case. This thesis has explored that it is much better to encourage people to remember well. Forgiveness is at the heart of this process, a process that requires the victim not to suppress or deny the memories of the past, but to remember them in a healthy manner that can enable healing to take place. This remembering well unfolds through the victim's choice and acceptance, the choice to accept the wounds of the event, the perpetrator, and the victim's own emotions. The wounds of a serious offense, which is often a traumatic experience, can have psychological... That's kind of cool. Anyways. I already said that. To forgive is to offer grace and mercy to the one who has caused hurt and pain. It releases the offender from his guilt. Forgiveness is one of humanity's greatest gift. Just as Katie's story portrayed, forgiveness is possible. By putting into practice the components of remembering well, which include the choice to accept the reality of one's past, the emotions, and rather than denial, and facing the truth of who the perpetrator really is, forgiveness may be offered. Forgiveness and remembering well is a process that requires intentionality, strength, courage, and grace. Even though it may be risky and painful, forgiveness has the incredible ability to heal wounded hearts and memories and bless the perpetrator.
A few moments with some questions, comments that you might have for Janell.
You mentioned it a little bit in that last chapter, but how significant do you think the people surrounding the victims are in that process of telling the narrative and remembering well? Can they have a significant impact on whether one is even able to do that or not?
I think so. Just thinking of Katie's story, though, I think it is possible to do it, not necessarily without it, but they didn't understand how she could move forward like that. They didn't get it. She also left Squamish, BC, where she lived, so it was a small community, and she didn't keep many of those relationships just because they had a hard time supporting her in what she did, and understanding why she was doing it. So, in that sense, she talks a lot in her book of how she didn't have very many friendships, didn't have very many friends that stuck by her. I mean, her family obviously did, but and leaving town shortly in the months after didn't help that either. So, I mean, it would be great if the people surrounding you supported you and understood, definitely. But as it is not necessarily a normal thing to do after such a serious offense, that community of support isn't often there. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Do you think it actually could be harder for people who aren't the first, not like the victim, but do you think it could be harder for the other people to understand that forgiveness and that?
I think it is, yeah. I think if they're not ready for that mindset and they're still hurting in their own way, to even be able to fathom the fact that this person has chosen to forgive would probably be nearly impossible, I think. Because there's those feelings of emotions and those feelings of revenge and hate that are often the result.
I love the part where you talked about mirrors of both, and it made me think of, you were talking about the TRC earlier in your presentation. Someone who testified at the TRC, Cynthia Ngewu, her son Jabulani was killed in a famous incident called the Dumule 7, along with 6 other anti-apartheid activists. Mm-hmm. And this is the first part of my question. The legislation that enacted the TRC said that the victim didn't need to forgive the perpetrator, and the perpetrator didn't need to express remorse for the amnesty to be granted in that context. And you said, and I agree with you, that forgiveness is a huge part of reconciliation. But something that Ngewu said when a reporter asked her, are you going to forgive the perpetrator? There were several in this case. She said, if it means I get to be a human again, and it means they get to be human again, then that's what I have to do. And so what I wonder, and you don't have to answer this, it's a huge question. What do you say to the enactors of that legislation, or what do you say to the idea of a reconciliation without forgiveness?
I think the fact that I've just studied for the past 8 months, looking at it as forgiveness being a huge part of it, I think it would take me some time to chew on that thought for a while before. Yeah, that's a whole nother thought.
Tutu has interesting things to say about
Yeah,
it.
he does.
You talked about forgiveness as a craft, and how maybe there's the progression of apprenticeship to, maybe possibly eventual mastery. Now, I guess my question is, the people around Kate, I guess her name was, you said they didn't understand, they were very uncomfortable with it. So I'm curious if, from your study, the case study, what brought her from where I would lump myself in with these other individuals to that place? Can you enter the apprenticeship before grief? Was it in the moment of grief that crystallized something that she saw in the nature of the cycle of violence and how maybe to counteract it? Had she been through past grief? How do you get to apprenticeship?
I think from the perspective of Katie's story, it was when she had to go home and tell her 4-year-old twins that their daddy was never coming home again. That was the defining moment that she chose not to let this be something that the rest of their lives is encompassed by. She didn't want the fact of Bob's death to be a focal point of I guess, I don't know if I'm wording that correctly. But I think it was then that she decided that there was something more to this. It was then that she decided and told the twins that there was a gift in this. They would find it somehow. She didn't know at the time what it would be, but they would find it. After meeting Ryan, the perpetrator, she reflects in her book of how the night before meeting him, she wondered if that was going to be the gift. And I'm pretty, like, she concluded that yes, it was. But also knowing that Bob was murdered, that his death was so brutal, she wanted to move beyond that. She didn't want that also to be a focal point. She wanted more than that. And I think that's what made her pursue her response that she did. Not her view of not wanting to be angry, not having anger, because anger is the cause of so much pain and brokenness. You know, like.
Do you remember if there's anything in particular in her past that prepared her for that?
There's nothing in the book that really said that. Well, her father passed away from cancer when she was a teenager, but other than that, there was nothing like an offense as such that she experienced. But it was also, Bob lived well. She refers to that in her book a lot, and describes the life that Bob lived, which also inspired her and gave her hope. She wanted to live like he had. She wanted to not succumb, like live negatively and etc. But to be full of life.
It's a very inspiring story. I
It is.
think that I just, I'm maybe doubtful that everyone has the capacity. Do you believe that everyone has the capacity to respond as Kate did?
I think her story is remarkable, and I think that people can do that, but I also think, like my theology chapter explores, that it is a learning. It is a learning process, and it does take time. So I don't know if people can forgive as quickly as Katie did. I think that aspect of her story is amazing. But I think with time and with processing and with following through on the aspects of remembering well that I speak of, I think eventually one could be. It is that learning. Yeah.
Okay, I think
Agnes?
I wonder if the whole image of apprentice and mastery could be seen as, maybe it doesn't get easier and easier to forgive, but the master, the person who has become, is mastering the process. I don't know, maybe knows what's ahead more than the apprentice, so that, do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Just in response to that, like what I didn't touch on too much in my presentation, what I do talk about is can you repeat briefly?
I'm just thinking, maybe the process of forgiveness is somebody has to forgive again and again and again, and maybe the forgiveness becomes deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
And maybe the person who masters that knows that it's going to happen, knows that bitterness or hurt, grief will return, and that it'll just be a deepening process.
Yeah.
Rather than it's going to be a snap once you're a master at forgiveness.
Yeah. My thought in that chapter, I discuss how you're always going to have to forgive again and again for different offense, and each circumstance is going to be different. But with more like past experience of forgiving. you can continually forgive, and your capability of forgiving maybe will be stronger than the past time. If that speaks to what you're saying.
Janelle, thank you so much for choosing this topic. It's such a huge and important topic. So
Thanks.
Which is, what you said in your thesis was beautiful, and it really spoke and helped clarify my own personal life when I walked through our Islamic church stuff. And did you explore anywhere where the difference between choosing and not choosing, and one thing, number one thing is just choose? Would you say that's one of her first things that she made?
Mm-hmm.
And then continue to choose no matter what would make the difference?
Yeah.
Where the person goes or doesn't go.
Yeah, I think that to be true. I think you have to continually choose and continually accept, even if it gets harder.
Yeah, like in spite of emotions,
Yeah.
and in spite of, because
Yeah.
even if you don't feel like it, just the fact that you can say I choose, even though you're angry, you
Yeah.
still, the fact that's the very first step.
Definitely.
Okay, Maddie and then Pete.
I have a question that's maybe a little bit of a game changer here. So I noticed, like, I don't know, I haven't read your entire thesis. I'm sorry if that's a shock to you.
What?
But I noticed that you don't seem to have too strong a focus on, like, there's a focus, but there's not too strong of a reliance on faith in the message you just, at least the amount of it you shared, which is, I think, a good thing. Because, here's the kicker. And I guess I don't want to distract too much, but I know, like, living in this community, there's a mix of Christianity and not Christianity, to be vague, and that's very much so in the world as well. So an argument that is primarily faith-based on forgiveness wouldn't necessarily be all too helpful. So I guess my real question is, in a secular, individual, self-centered society, what is compelling about forgiveness? What could compel someone with no association to any existence of God or existence of something greater than a self even? Maybe even what's compelling in a secular world?
I think for that, for one, is one's own healing, to forgive, but also there are good people in the world that are not Christians, that strive to be good and strive to live a good life and strive for harmony.
Like Katie.
Like Katie, exactly. Katie was not, she didn't hold those views too strongly. So I think in that sense, just that desire to heal brokenness and to live in a world that already has so much destruction in it, why encourage that or aid that? I think that is a huge compelling point.
Yeah, just more comments, I think, just because this term I was teaching theological reflections on suffering once more, and so I had to read Desmond Tutu and reread Desmond Tutu and No Future Without Forgiveness. And when he sort of maps out what the TRC does in South Africa, he says, it's not Nuremberg trying to bring perpetrators to justice. We didn't have the time or the resources to do it. It's not blanket amnesty like in Chile. But if we don't try to face it and allow the stories to be told, then we're just going to do what every other society has done over and over again and have cycles of violence. We've got Ireland and Rwanda and the Middle East. And so there's a very good reason right there, and it must be the same for individuals as well. And then the other thing that came up in our course that relates is that when you talk about forgiveness as a process, very often, just a simple way to imagine this is think of a child who's sexually assaulted, and then through life, maybe doesn't even deal with it very well for years, or maybe represses, but suddenly has to deal with it at a certain point when it's just bursting out of her unconscious. And so she has to face it and has to go through whatever steps are necessary to be able to live her life. But then there are other pivotal moments in her life. She's going to get married, but she's afraid of intercourse. She's going to have children, and she's overwhelmingly afraid for what will happen to them in the world. So, you know, all along the way, there's such a deepening need for a forgiveness process, spurred on by all the events of life.
Janell, I'm going to make a couple of comments and you can pick up on any of them or choose not to, and they're not connected, they're all pretty random. But I'm going to push back a little bit, just on the assumption that to forgive is unnatural. I think that was the assumption that you made and that we collectively, we make that assumption that it's unnatural to forgive. Well, what if it isn't unnatural, and what if that's a collective or cultural, that we become predisposed to that assumption because of the culture that we live in? And you could probably counter that with looking, and you may have come across some evidence that is cross-cultural, that there is some innate human tendency to not forgive, but I just wonder about that. And then, but to take it another step and say, but if it is the culture, if there is some cultural determination in that predisposition that we don't forgive, that has become our nature, then in the body of Christ, isn't that one way in which we're empowered to be different than our nature or than the culture around us? So if you were to sort of entertain the idea that maybe Katie's experience wasn't as unnatural, maybe the unnatural thing was the response of her friends and people around her, you know, which again, I think that speaks into how much we are formed by community around us. And so her decision to leave that community and seek help in another way. So that's just one strand. The other one is in terms of grief and forgiveness. How much are they entangled? Like, to forgive is maybe a decision that she made, which doesn't erase the need for her to grieve. But you haven't really separated those two things. How intertwined are they, and can they be separated? And there was a third, but I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't really know how to immediately respond to those thoughts, but they're good thoughts. I think grief and forgiveness, like, I feel like they're connected, but I also feel like they're not. In what I feel like what I've studied is forgiveness does not the choice to forgive does not undermine one's emotions, is even though they choose to do that. Whereas like in Katie's instance, people thought because she chose to forgive, she wasn't actually grieving. So I guess that's my tidbit of response.
Well, I was really glad you remembered that, because it's interesting that was the public reception of it. If you're forgiving, you're not grieving, even though she clearly was very much grieving and in pain, even while forgiving.
Is it the idea that when you've forgiven, you've reached the end of grieving? Like, it's a thing which happens when you are no longer in pain, so that if you've already forgiven, you must not have experienced much pain. Like, that seems to be the...
You mean the public perception?
The public, like the understanding of how you're only able to forgive when it doesn't hurt anymore or something. Or that you can only stop hurting when you're able to forgive is the other side of that coin.
I think in my research and in my thinking and writing, a part of the process is, the beginning of it is like dealing with your own emotions as the victim. And once that is started, then you can turn attention to the perpetrator. I feel like that's kind of the connection I've made, that those emotions have to be addressed first, because you're still going to feel the pain. And even for other circumstances, unlike Katie, there still will be anger and resentment felt. And that is okay, and that is obviously appropriate, like that can be felt and should be felt rather than suppressed. So to deal with those, and then once you're beyond the initial sting, of the offense, you can start thinking about the perpetrator and forgiving.
Okay, let's wrap up with Tom and then Dan.
Last night I was doing some reading about how we tend to mask ourselves all the time, and how it was speaking about our relationship with the Lord and with one another, and how we need to be able to free ourselves of the mask. The term was used about sort of get naked before God. And I was thinking about the perpetrator and how, the moment that happens, that's who he is. He's naked. It's all sort of revealed. And this person was noting that, that some of the fears we had about being real is that, if you really knew me, you wouldn't love me, right? But our greatest need is to have someone know us and yet love us, right? And I guess I was just thinking about the perpetrator and thinking, because of her action, that was a very good day for him.
Yeah.
That the healing in her life is one aspect, but in his life, it has to be absolutely profound. And because you said something about the memory of the wrongdoing holds a person captive, right? And so that memory, once a person forgives, I think it has to be totally transformed.
Yeah.
When they think back in the light of being forgiven. And I don't know, there was a question in there somewhere, but I lost it. I remember often thinking that St. Stephen, when he forgave Paul, I don't know whether this is theologically true or anything, but I've often thought that that act was contributed to him being able to receive later on, right?
Yeah.
Somehow mysteriously that. So if there's a question in there, you just go for it. There was originally a question.
I appreciate your thoughts. You can ask me the question later.
Okay, Dan and then we'll run.
It seems like you focused on one person forgiving another person. Did you look at all at self-forgiveness or forgiveness of self?
Not really. I think I encountered it a few times. Maybe I referenced it once, but I don't think I actually did.
Let's go to your thesis.
Yeah. It's beyond the scope of my